without your face. But what can I do? 'Cause I'm just a sinking ship, and you're just a pair of lips that I've lost in the moment. All I want is for you to come back. Now I'm caught in the middle of life, and I need you to.
I'm not able to hear you. I'm not sure what happened. Sure. My audio. See if the audience can hear. A second. I think something's wrong with the audio. I think you're muted.
Here we are.
Yes, now I can hear you. Great.
Okay, lines got crossed. How's it going, Brian?
It's going well. Thank you so much for having me back on.
No, thank you for coming, Brian, because there's so much that has happened and so much that is happening. Brian, I want to run something across you before we get into the Russian situation. I want to rewind and just go back to Trump for a second, because I know a lot of people are looking at the tariffs that Trump said that he's introducing. And I want to introduce another thought to you. We know that Trump is preoccupied with preventing China's rise. We know that is the main thing of most of the U.S. presidents now, because they see China as the most pressing and imminent threat. Now, with these sanctions, I believe they were somewhat of a head fake. And what I mean by that, and you can give me your assessment on this, I believe that they were a head fake in a way that he promised to levy 25% sanctions on Canada, a 25% sanction Mexico, and a 10% sanction on China. At the last moment with his trading partners, Mexico and Canada, he come with this deal not to levy taxes on them. But he did not stop in levying taxes on China. Is this the opening salvo of that trade war to try to weaken China, to prevent it from really overtaking the United States in nominal growth? Because we already know that in purchasing power parity, it has surpassed the United States. So do you believe that this was a head fake by the Trump administration to make people believe that in the last hour of the moment that he came up with a deal with Canada and Mexico, but could not come up with accommodating deal with China?
I think you're onto something there. And I think something else you just said that is extremely important for people to understand is that this is not a Trump policy, even though it's being implemented by the Trump administration. You're absolutely correct when you say this is all about preventing the rise of China. This is an obsession of the unelected special interests that drive U.S. foreign policy, the so-called deep state that many Trump supporters believe President Trump is in opposition to, even though all of his policy is obviously in service of these interests. And I'm not entirely sure that these tariffs aimed at Canada and Mexico aren't going to be implemented eventually or imposed some other way. Same goes for Europe. The problem the United States has is it has created an international system that it used for decades to exploit nations and extract wealth from them, not just across the developing world, but also nations like Canada, Mexico, Europe, all of these places, the entire planet. Now, because of the proliferation of technology, the industrialization of the developing world, the leveling of the playing field, this system is no longer benefiting the US in this way, in this exploitative imperialist way. So now it needs to deconstruct this system because it's working in reverse. It's working against the United States. And so that's what they're trying to do. Unfortunately for them, and a lot of people believe this is to reindustrialize the United States. And I don't think they quite appreciate the complexity and the scale that reindustrializing the United States represents. We're talking about, you would have to reform the entire education system. You would have to reform the entire way industry is looked at in the US. You would have to reform and rebuild all of America's infrastructure. No one's even pretending that they're going to even try to do these things, let alone actually begin a process of doing these things. So it's not about reindustrializing the US. It's about preserving these monopolies, these pyramid schemes, these Ponzi schemes that the US has imposed on the planet by, just as you said, preventing the continued rise of the rest of the world, led first and foremost by China.
Well, do you think that there, because I talked to Larry Johnson earlier today, I had a show with him earlier today, and a lot of people are of the belief that Trump is putting America under new management and shifting everything. But I asked the question, do you believe that it's a little too late because of all the antagonizing of the world and because of the impossible debt burden that America has? And because it seems like to me they jumped off the wagon, pointing the finger at everybody. It's everybody's fault. It's Panama's fault. It's Mexico's fault. It's Canada's fault. It's Greenland's fault. It's China's fault. It's this fault. It's that fault. But it's never America's fault for the situation that she finds herself in. It reminds me of, as little kids, you know, the little kid, it's always somebody else's fault and it's never their fault. And they can't understand why people are saying, are you sure you're not to blame for it? Don't you think that regardless of administration, that they're acting like little children by blaming everybody else for the position that America now finds herself in, especially when they start talking about unfair trade practices, and nobody has had more of an unfair advantage when it comes to trade, commerce, and finance than the United States has in the last 100 years.
Absolutely. I was just listening to Vice President Vance accuse China of stealing American jobs. China stole absolutely nothing. All of those jobs were voluntarily shipped over to China to take advantage of then very cheap labor, lax regulations, zero environmental regulations, workplace safety regulations. They took advantage of that. And now that not only has China risen, they have their own companies now out competing the United States, out competing the US inside China, out competing the US all around the planet. So what America is actually upset about, and what they will never admit, is the fact that they are incapable of competing fairly with China. And when you really think about it, it doesn't even make sense. China is so much larger than the US, has such a larger industrial base, world-class infrastructure the US would take decades to catch up with. Just the high-speed rail network alone, just mind-boggling. If you haven't been to China, it's almost impossible to explain in words the scale everything is in China. And so it doesn't even make sense for the US to try to compete with China. It would be like, I'm trying to think of an example here. It would be like the UK complaining that its economy, its industry, its military isn't as large as the United States. It doesn't make any sense. It is a smaller country, smaller population, geographically smaller. Everything about it is smaller. So why do you think you would have more power and influence than the US. Doesn't make any sense. And this is something the US has to come to grips with. This is reality. You are a smaller country than China. You are going to have less power than China, and you need to accept that because that's reality. And if you are going to rail against reality, then you will have all kinds of very bad consequences down the road. I really don't think that Trump is reorganizing America and putting it under new administration. I was just listening to him talk about how there needs to be maximum pressure on Iran, that they're not allowed to have nuclear weapons. If they assassinate senior leaders in the American government, the same way the US has already assassinated senior leaders in the Iranian government, they will obliterate all of Iran. That sounds very much like the deep state that he campaigned against on the campaign trail.
Mm-hmm. Well, Brian, it's amazing. See, great minds think alike. It's amazing that you brought that subject up. I have two clips. They're very short clips that I want to play. I want to remind the people of these things right here. So the first one is John Kerry. It's very important that people pay attention to this, especially after we played the second clip. This is only about a minute clip. So everybody pay close attention to Mr. John Kerry when he was Secretary of State of the United States. So pay attention.
Are you kidding me? The United States is going to start sanctioning our allies and their banks and their businesses because we walked away from a deal, and we're going to force them to do what we want them to do even though they agreed to the deal we came to? Are you kidding? That is a recipe quickly, my friends, for them to walk away from Ukraine, where they are already very dicey and ready to say, well, we've done our bit. They were ready, in many cases, to say, well, we're the ones paying the price for your sanctions. It was Obama who went out and actually put together a sanctions regime that had an impact. I went to China. We persuaded China, don't buy more oil. We persuaded India and other countries to step back. Can you imagine trying to sanction them after persuading them to put in place sanctions to bring Iran to the negotiating table? And when they have not only come to the table, but they made a deal, we turn around and nix the deal and then tell them you're going to have to obey our rules on the sanctions anyway. That is a recipe very quickly, my friends, business people here, for the American dollar to cease to be the reserve currency of the world, which is already bubbling out there.
So I played that clip as a precursor to something, because remember what Kerry said. He talked to all of these government leaders, and it was already bubbling out there that people wanted to pull away from the dollar. And if the United States pulled out of the JCPOA, the deal that they forced other nations to accept, then this could be spell the end of the dollar. Now, I want to follow that up with this.
The Iran deal is defective at its core. If we do nothing, we know exactly what will happen. In just a short period of time, the world's leading state sponsor of terror will be on the cusp of acquiring the world's most dangerous weapon. At the heart of the Iran deal was a giant fiction that a murderous regime desired only a peaceful nuclear energy program. Therefore, I am announcing today that the United States will withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal. We will not allow a regime that chants death to America to gain access to the most deadly weapons on earth. The United States no longer makes empty threats. When I make promises, I keep them.
Have him pull it out of the JCPOA, and we heard the consequences of what might follow had that taken place now. Because I want to put this on a timeline so that you can have your say on it. I want you to listen to the next short clip concerning the dollar and nations pulling away from the dollar.
Look, it goes beyond these things. That just today, Brazil, in our hemisphere, largest country in the Western Hemisphere south of us, cut a trade deal with China. They're going to, from now on, do trade in their own currencies, get right around the dollar. They're creating a secondary economy in the world, totally independent of the United States. We won't have to talk about sanctions in 5 years because there'll be so many countries transacting in currencies other than the dollar that we won't have the ability to sanction them.
Now, this drive toward de-dollarization that we see led by countries like China and Brazil is angering the United States. And a clear example of this was the neoconservative Republican Senator Marco Rubio from Florida. When he heard about the news of China and Brazil de-dollarizing their trade and using their local currencies, Marco Rubio was furious. And on Fox News, he complained that if countries drop the dollar, the U.S. will no longer be able to sanction them. That's a very revealing quote, because it's really a U.S. official admitting that by maintaining the dominance of the US dollar around the world, the United States is able to weaponize its currency and turn it into a geopolitical tool to attack any country that carries out policies that Washington doesn't like. So the US has imposed.
We hear John Kerry give us an explanation of what could cause nations to leave the dollar. And then we follow that up with President Trump saying, we are officially leaving the JCPOA. And now we're hearing that more nations are using currencies outside of the dollar. And then we hear that Trump is now talking about, and I'll play this one last clip. Trump is talking about sanctioning countries that don't use the dollar. This is absolutely insane, because anyone with common sense can see the timeline. But just let me play this next clip.
President-elect Trump is vowing to impose 100% tariffs on BRICS nations unless they commit to not developing a new currency. Trump made the declaration in a Truth Social post Saturday, saying, quote, there is no chance that the BRICS will replace the U.S. dollar in international trade, and any country that tries should wave goodbye to America. BRICS is a group comprised of 9 countries with emerging economies. They initially included Russia, China, India, Brazil, and South Africa. But earlier this year, Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, and the United Arab Emirates formally joined the group. CBS News Money Watch correspondent Kelly O'Grady joins us now for more. Kelly, what effects would 100% tariffs on these nations have on consumers?
So look, if they were actually implemented, prices would likely go up, because companies importing goods from China, from Brazil, from those countries, they would have to pay a 100% tax on that. And then what would they do? They would likely pass that on to us. Maybe not the full amount, but likely a lot of that. And so the other thing to think about is we are already hearing, oh, we were thinking about a 10% tariff on China previously. There are already tariffs on China that exist right now. A lot of companies are thinking, well, where can I move my manufacturing? India is a good option. Indonesia, which has applied for membership to the BRICS bloc, is a good option. So now companies would also be thinking, okay, well, I can't do it in China. I can't do it over there. They might move manufacturing here, which would help with jobs, but also increase labor costs. But I said that's if it's implemented, right?
Okay.
This could also be a negotiating tactic.
Why is Trump pushing for this commitment for them to not develop their own currency?
So the U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency. The vast majority of transactions, when one company from one country and one company from another transact, they happen in the U.S. dollar. Okay. Money is power. And so if you were to have these other countries put together an alternative currency, some of that power could go away. That could be bad, because it would make it harder for us to pay off our debts, and it would also impact our...
Oh, Brian, the floor is yours, man. I'm telling you. What do you have to say about this, Brian?
Well, the extraordinary thing is that even though Kerry, I don't know when that clip was from, John Kerry's clip, but the thing is, the Obama administration made this deal with Iran knowing, before they even announced it, that they were going to deliberately sabotage it, blame it on Iran, and use it as a pretext for increased sanctions and possibly even war. And then this was achieved under the first Trump administration. When I talk about continuity of agenda, this is what I'm talking about. Every single administration plays its role. They pay lip service to the people they hope are not smart enough to see through this. And remember what the previous administration did: see through the partisan rhetoric and understand that it is the same policy being advanced administration to administration. And so while John Kerry is correct, and he's talking about how this is going to turn nations off from the dollar, what other choices does the U.S. have except to, again, face reality and admit that it has no right to dominate the planet, and it's not even probable. It's not even possible to do it anymore. They just simply don't have the power, the military might, the economic power to do it anymore. And so there is this shift, and everything the US does to try to reassert itself globally is going to turn nations off even more so. And this is a process you have to remember. There's many factors that are changing as this process unfolds. These nations are becoming stronger. They're increasing cooperation. This is something that isn't going to happen overnight. But people have been following this for a long time. They remember when BRICS first was introduced, and how many years have gone by and how much has been incrementally done over the years to build up this critical mass that we see now taking shape. I just want to ask, when Marco Rubio is whining about the U.S. and having the reserve currency of the globe, who agreed to that? What a vote was there where everyone voted and said, hey, let's all use the US dollar? What choice did nations have? And you're absolutely right. They are weaponizing it. Ben Norton does excellent work. He's absolutely right. They are weaponizing the US dollar to coerce and dominate the entire planet. No nation has any reason to submit themselves to that, except for the reality that up until now, they really had no choice. Now they have a choice. And I would say they have an imperative to fully undo this American system. If the United States does not want to find a constructive role to play within the multipolar world, let it sit there in the corner by itself, isolate it, strip it of its ability to politically interfere globally and intervene militarily, covertly, and just let it sit there in the corner until it's ready to grow up and play nice with the rest of the planet.
You know, I also have a colleague of mine, you may know him, Matthew Ehret. He's a journalist from Canada, and he does a lot of good work, and he's an author. And he did something on Elon Musk and how Elon Musk and his family has ties to the CIA and all of these intelligence groups. So if this is the case, and how they got their money through black operations or whatever, and through apartheid, I might add, everybody who's listening, how can you clean the swamp? I'm asking because I think these are legitimate questions for people who may want to know this. How can you clean the swamp if you're surrounding yourself with people like Rubio and Musk and other people like that? Is this a head fake, or is this being misled into thinking these guys have changed?
Oh no, I mean, it's just branding. It is continuity of agenda with the MAGA branding applied to it, hoping to trick at least part of the American population into continuing to go along with this. And if you look at the Biden administration, the Trump administration, they're selling the same agenda with different branding. They hope that if they can't get Democrats on board with war with China, they know they can get Republicans or people on the right versus people on the left, and vice versa regarding Russia. And so as long as you're holding up one of the tent poles, the whole tent, the whole circus tent that is the American empire is going to be held up. And that is the whole point of all of this. And it's a strategy of tension. It's a strategy to get people fighting against each other, divided, so that they don't come together and oppose these special interests that are behind all of these administrations. Just look at the Trump administration and look at the people who are fooling themselves into believing some sort of change is really at hand. He says he's going to drain the swamp. He said this the first time. He's saying it again, but he has surrounded himself with the worst swamp creatures there are. He's dredging out the swamp to make it deeper so he can put bigger swamp creatures in. So I don't see how this is progress at all. Marco Rubio heading the State Department and people saying U.S. aid is being dismantled. And then it's not dismantled. It's placed directly under the State Department. How do people see that as progress and not a tool of interference abroad being sharpened or streamlined to do even more damage globally ahead of the struggle that we see taking shape, with Trump himself saying openly, we're going to maintain dollar dominance? How is that not the core issue between that, China, Iran? How are these not the core issues of the so-called deep state that Biden himself pursued? Another thing, one thing I want to point out also is this issue of tariffs. People are saying this is Trump's America First agenda, and he implemented these during his first administration. But do we recall President Biden keeping all of the tariffs in place and, as a matter of fact, expanding them during his presidency and then handing it back over to Trump, who is now building on top of what Biden did? How do people not see that this is continuity of agenda? And this is the actual, if you want to call it deep state, this is the deep state advancing its agenda just with different branding. I just don't understand how people aren't seeing this.
And to add on to that, I was listening to some of the clips that I had downloaded on one of my computers today, older clips, and I was doing a comparative analysis, and I was taking some of the things that Biden would say, and then I was putting it next to some of the things that Trump would say. And it's pretty much the same when it comes to Israel. It's pretty much the same when it comes to China. It's pretty much the same when it comes to Africa. It's pretty much the same when it comes to Latin America. And the only difference is one is more openly antagonistic towards Russia than the other. But as I saw today, an article came out where Trump said that if Ukraine pays in resources, then they'll continue supplying weapons to Ukraine. Where is this? I'll stop the war in 30 days or less than a month or something. And why, Brian? Why do you think these things that we point out get mistaken for being antagonistic against Trump, instead of people looking at it and say, listen, these guys called out Biden, these guys called out Obama, these guys are calling out Trump, and if Trump does something good, we'll give him the credit for it. But why do you believe it's because they're looking for some idea and something to believe in the midst of a collapse of American imperialism?
Yes, or we can compare it to a sinking ship, and they're just trying to cling to anything that looks like it floats. And so they're investing all their hope not into a principle and standing by that principle and picking out the people who are upholding that principle. They're placing all of their faith into people. And I'm telling you that if you put your faith into people, you will be disappointed every single time. Pick and stand by a principle. And if people are upholding that principle, support them. And when they're not, condemn them, point it out, expose it. That's all we're doing. And it's just a fact of reality that Biden administration, the Trump administration, the Obama administration, Bush Jr., Bush Sr., Clinton, all of them, they have all advanced this exact same agenda, albeit with different branding, but it is the exact same agenda. And I have also laid out step by step how from Bush Sr. to Clinton to Bush Jr., Obama, Trump, Biden, now back to Trump, how they do this step by step. They prepare the next step for the next administration in their antagonism towards Russia. A lot of people are saying that Trump is friendlier with Russia or less antagonistic. But just remember, he was the one who started arming Ukraine ahead of the special military operation in the first place. That is almost certainly what precipitated it. But it would have happened if Hillary Clinton was president. It would have still happened because it's continuity of agenda. The president is in charge of nothing, and people are kidding themselves to believe otherwise. They don't understand how power works. Power works by whoever has money and guns, and who has more money and guns has more power. And Trump and the people around him, people who think that they're independent of the so-called deep state, they don't nearly have enough money or guns to overpower the deeply entrenched special interests that actually are running the Trump administration. And there's plenty of people in his administration who represent and work for these special interests, demonstrably so. So it really, it's just human nature. People want to hope. They want to place their hope into something. Reality is ugly. And people who study this and do analysis objectively and face reality, the uncomfortable reality of the truth, it is soul crushing. And a lot of people want to spare themselves that, and they want to place their hope into something. They want to believe that Trump is going to turn things around, but he's not. And he already is completely 100% seamlessly continuing everything that was handed over to him by Biden, just like he did his first administration following Obama.
Do you think it is something like people would rather believe in illusion instead of despair? You know, because it seems like I guess because Trump is now deporting people, and which I want to talk on that for a minute also. He's deporting people, and he's saying that America has the right to secure borders, and America is doing it. And yet at the same time, he's saying that he's going to withdraw the funding for South Africa, which is owed to South Africa, for South Africa redistributing the land that was forcefully taken from them, and they're trying to secure their borders. So how is that not imperialistic? Because remember, Biden did the same thing. So I'm trying to make heads or tails of this, because it seems like people purposely leave off these points so that they can get a picture that is desirable to them instead of addressing the issues at hand. And if you do that, you'll never come to a good solution.
Yes, well, with this, I mean, I was absolutely floored by this statement by President Trump regarding South Africa. People just have to ask themselves, what are a bunch of white people walking around in South Africa for in the first place? Has anyone even stopped and asked themselves why that is? And so, that might, if you can answer that question, you might understand why there might be some issue right now in South Africa. But out of one side of his mouth, he's talking about how unfairly white folks are being treated in South Africa after settling, exploiting it for generations, literally trying to exterminate the indigenous population there. And then out of the other side of his mouth, he's talking about exterminating the Palestinians, wiping them out of Gaza, displacing them or killing them. He and Biden and Obama and Bush and every other president since Israel was created and began its existence as a forward operating base for the American empire, they have been supplying them weapons to physically exterminate the Palestinians from Gaza and the West Bank. So how does that add up? And it only adds up if you understand that he's pandering to a support base who many of them are they are just plain racist. They're racist. They believe white people are superior. This is at the root of this obsession with China. This is a non-white nation that is just rapidly outpacing and surpassing the U.S. and doing so irreversibly. And there's nothing the U.S. can do about it. And people are having a meltdown. If they could just face reality and accept that things, and all things being equal, they have more people, better infrastructure, and a bigger industrial base. And if you could just accept that, you wouldn't be freaking out as much as they are. And I know these people. I'm an American. I grew up in America. I was surrounded by racist people my whole childhood growing up, and in the Marine Corps also, before I left the Marines and the U.S. permanently. I was surrounded by these people. I know how they think. I know how they look down on the rest of the world. I listened to it every single day of my life. And I know that's not just ignorant rank and file next to me, but it's also the officers and it's also officials. They all believe this. They believe in their own superiority over everyone else. And they will not tolerate a world in which others who they believe are inferior are surpassing them. So I mean, this is at the root of it, and this is why there's so much blatant hypocrisy, because they're starting from a irrational, fantastical starting points that they are superior. So if you're starting with a fiction, everything you build on top of it is going to lean further and further away from reality. And that's where we are right now. And that's why nothing makes sense. That's why American foreign policy doesn't make sense. It's irrational. It's unsustainable. And yet they continue to double down on it. I mean, someone like Marco Rubio, if you followed him throughout his career, I mean, this is a guy who honestly believes Chinese people are just like chattering, weird, subhuman, and we cannot allow them this power. They are human beings and they have this power, and you have to reckon with that. But he won't. And so there's going to be a clash, and it's just a matter of how much damage, when does it happen, and how much damage happens when this delusion finally and fully crashes into reality.
And my thing on this, Brian, is this. I believe that it's so much imperial hubris that has seeped down into the minds of the leadership of not only just America but the Western world, that it is going to be almost impossible for them to willingly accept China as an equal or China surpassing them. I think that they are preparing themselves for the eventuality of war, because they're saying, if we can't rule, we're not allowing anybody that doesn't look like us, act like us, speak like us, have a culture like us to rule. And that's why they always trumpet this mantra, democratic values, Western values. Who's to say that democracy is right for that person or people over there or that nation over there? And especially a nation that has thousands of years of culture and history, and you have less than 300-400 years. Who's to say that your way of governance is better for them? And how can you, the way, I'm gonna put a good example out for you. If what I'm doing is good for me, and I think it'll be good for you, instead of me pulling my gun out, kicking in your door and putting it up to your head saying, hey, listen, do what I say, shouldn't I lead by example? And if you see that it works for me and that it could be good for you, you would accept it and embrace what's good for you and use it to your benefit, instead of always on people's doorstep with the barrel of a gun. Don't you think that with this mindset of imperial hubris, and that by divine right, we must rule and we must dictate, because you hear it regardless of president, America must lead, America must do this. If Russia comes up with something, they stole it from us. Even if the United States doesn't have it, if China comes up with something, they had to steal it from us. But you don't have it, so how did they steal it from you? To me, that is so ingrained into the mind of the leaders that it's going to be all but impossible to avoid a war, because they will not accept China as an equal or greater power than them.
Absolutely. And I was reading the transcript of Secretary Rubio's interview with the Megyn Kelly show. This was on the State Department's official website. And he's sitting there saying that America doesn't want war. And we hear this all the time, regardless of what administration happens to be in power. We don't want war. But the subtext there is, we don't want war. All you have to do is do what we tell you, and there won't be any war. That's what they actually mean. They're not saying we're going to try to make concessions, meet you halfway, accept reality to avoid war. No, they're saying all China has to do is just allow us to encircle them, contain them, run their economy into the ground, divide, destroy their political system, and then extract all the wealth and cheap labor that we had been for decades. And then there won't be any war. And Iran can live peacefully in the Middle East as long as they allow us to overthrow their government, put a client regime back into power. We just heard Trump talking about how Iran is this irrational sponsor of terrorism, threatening peace and stability. Do we remember why this conflict began with Iran in the first place? The U.S. literally overthrew the government in Iran, installed the client regime that squatted on the country for years, and the people finally overthrew it and took their country back. And ever since, the U.S., the British, have been trying to reverse that. And that is at the root of that conflict. So you're absolutely right. Again, it is this sense of superiority that is not real. It is not true, genuine superiority. They're trying to impose it on a world that is increasingly stronger, better organized, and more powerful. And so, yes, there's going to be, there can only be conflict, because they will not accept anything else. They don't have the ability to impose it through any other means but conflict. And the one thing that you said that scares me the most, and this is my biggest concern, is that they will not accept China surpassing the U.S. It is inevitable that China will surpass the U.S. They will do anything to stop it, including just burn everything down. That is my fear, that they will start a war, even to the extent of using nuclear weapons, hoping that in the aftermath, upon the ashes, they will be able to build back better than China, faster and stronger. And that's what I honestly believe that they're even considering. And they've even talked about, say, Taiwan, which is a island province of China under international law, even according to U.S. bilateral agreements with Beijing. It is an island province of China. But they've even talked about any conflict between the U.S. and China over Taiwan and its status will result in the complete destruction of Taiwan. And yet they still say that this is something they should go ahead and do. So this is how far they're willing to go. If you have any question in your mind about the level of destruction they're willing to inflict to get their way, look at Ukraine. Look at Ukraine. Look at Gaza. Look at the West Bank. Look at Syria. Look at Iraq. This is how far they're willing to go all around the globe. So why not with China also? This is what we have to. This is what we have to worry about and wake people up to.
And Brian, what was with Trump ordering the bombing of Somalia just out of nowhere? I think that was a distraction tactic, because he was like, "Oh, these people are in caves," and it seems like every president has to do something like that when they're trying to vie for more political capital or whatever. They want somebody has to be a terrorist, and they have to be in lands far away, and the land that they attack cannot have enough military resolve to defend themselves against the American empire. Could this be the United States just lashing out because they see their position in the world collapsing? And being very mad that it is actually collapsing in a place that the U.S. and Europe thought that they would control in perpetuity, which is across Africa. They see France getting kicked out, Canada's getting kicked out, Germany's getting kicked out, Belgium. They see the likes of all of these European and NATO nations getting kicked out. Could that be lashing out because they see their position very fragile on the African continent? And we know that the resources that Europe needs is there, and they're losing. The United States and the West are losing their sway to China because China is coming in and producing with railroads, with trains, with schools, with transfer of technology. And as I was talking to one Chinese individual, they are also in a technology transfer scheme with a lot of the African nations, where they don't just come in and build stuff. After they build it, they transfer technology and know-how to those countries and build factories. Could America being outcompeted in that area, she's trying to create chaos to stop China and to prevent Africa's rise, and also to throw dirt in the eyes of Russia?
Exactly. I mean, that is exactly it. That's what they're doing here in Southeast Asia. This is what they're doing worldwide. They cannot compete with China. It is impossible for them to compete with China. Even if a real leader got into power in the U.S., made all the right decisions, it would take decades to reform the U.S. into a functioning, constructive nation state rather than an empire. And so that is exactly what they're doing. They can't compete in Africa, so they're going to just knock everything down. They can't compete here in Southeast Asia, so their goal is to just create chaos and burn everything to the ground. They attempted to install a client regime in Myanmar. The military overthrew it, and since then, the U.S. has been pumping arms and money into these opposition groups to create an armed conflict that is preventing Myanmar from functioning as a normal, prosperous nation state. They're right next to Thailand, same weather, same resources, and yet they're impoverished and they're destabilized precisely because the U.S. was able to get in there and destabilize it. They're attacking Chinese infrastructure in Myanmar. Part of the Belt and Road Initiative goes through Myanmar. So they're physically attacking it with these militants that they arm. In fact, they're doing the same thing in Pakistan. If you watch the news and you see these headlines about bombings in Baluchistan or anywhere in western or southwestern Pakistan, if you read the details, it's almost always targeting Chinese engineers or China-Pakistan economic corridor infrastructure, pipelines, roads, power plants, and there's a port in Gwadar. And so that is exactly what they're doing. And here is President Trump fighting against the deep state, so we're told, and yet he's carrying on with this global campaign to slash and burn because they're unable to compete and they're being displaced. And they can't have it. If they cannot win the game, they're going to flip the board over. That's what President Biden was presiding over. That is now what President Trump is presiding over. Continuity of agenda, whether people want to accept it or not, whether they want to admit it or not.
And you know, along the lines of what you were talking about, that goes to say about the situation with Panama and how Marco Rubio went there to threaten Panama because Panama was going to be one of the crucial links in the Belt and Road in South America. So we see if they can't compete, is I'm going to kill, I'm going to burn, I'm going to destroy, I'm going to sanction, I'm going to demonize and dehumanize you so that if my war machine needs to go in there, then we're fighting terrorists or we're fighting dictators or we're fighting thugs or something like that. And back over to Africa, I want to play something for you. These are short clips, because I really want your thoughts on this. So I'm going to play this clip real quick, and I'll follow it up with what the senator had to say, the congressman had to say on this.
All right, to the U.S. now. A top American diplomat has said that the U.S. must consider Chinese influence in Africa, or else it could become exceedingly more difficult for American companies to get rare elements from the continent.
We need to do more, and we have to contest Chinese actions, not only in terms of their forward-facing strategy, but their desire to go after Africa's rare earths that will be critical for our industrial and technological capabilities. The 20-year engagement in the Middle East was largely about ground forces, about army, about special forces. We made all the appropriate investments. We modernized, we innovated. Now is the Navy and the Air Force's time. They have to step up. They have to invest more. They have to be more innovative. They have to be more intrepid, and they've got to understand that the Indo-Pacific arena requires the most capable naval and advanced long-range air capabilities that the United States has ever needed before.
Now, what the Deputy Secretary of State forgot to mention is an ever-rising trade volume between China and the African continent. Chinese investments have helped build railways, power plants, and other infrastructure. All these contrasts greatly with the U.S. approach, and that is echoed by a former ECOWAS diplomat, Haruna Wakani.
America's perspective of what Africa was and believing that Africa is still the same is the problem. They have come as an imperial master, kind of, or neo-colonialist, and so they didn't bother about whether Africa wants the relationship or not, or what kind of relationship are we talking about here. All they came with is to dictate. You are not likely to see any project completed by America for the benefit of Africans. I mean, in Africa, for the benefit of Africans. If we'll take a simple look at, in the last 20 years, for instance, the total number of railway lines, brand new railway lines that have been extended across Africa is amazing. The total number of airports that have been revamped and new ones that have been built with Chinese funds and expertise is beyond belief. Dams, power stations, roads, and other infrastructure, parliament buildings all over Africa. They are doing so much.
So we see that the congressmen, they're not concerned with the welfare or the economic growth or the prosperity of Africa. They're thinking about outcompeting China and bringing China to yield so that they can dominate. And this in this short 19-second clip, one Senator Todd Young, I played this before. Senator Todd Young let it slip out exactly America's thought feeling on Africa.
How can we help foster
the
public-private partnerships, bringing American capital and expertise and standards to Africa so that we can keep exploiting, so that we can exploring where we can get these minerals?
Sorry, I mean, because I'm not even kidding. That is exactly how they talk when there are no cameras. They just talk about, we're just going to go in there. These people, they're just sitting in there wasting the resources. We should take them. We'll do more with them than they ever will. And that is how they think, and that's how they talk. And every once in a while, it slips out, and it's funny, but it's also not funny because this is their policy that they have imposed on Africa. And it's not just the US, this goes all the way back to European colonization. So we're talking hundreds and hundreds of years of squatting on other human beings, taking everything from them, taking them themselves and shipping them overseas as slaves. And then hundreds of years later, they're still doing it. They're so uninspired, so backwards in their mentality that they're still doing this in the 21st century. When they have the technology to bring peace, prosperity to every single human being on earth, they're still thinking about how to squeeze every single penny out of every single person instead. And China has come along with a better alternative, and it's a no-brainer for anyone with a brain to pick that over what the U.S. has to offer. The U.S. has nothing to offer. When he's talking about bringing standards and all of this nonsense to Africa, he's talking about administrative control over Africa, brainwashing people in Africa to serve their interests at the expense of their own interests, their own people's interests, their own country's interests. That is exactly what all these agencies do. USAID, NED, and we're all hearing about all the wedge issues that USAID was funding. I haven't actually had, and correct me if I'm wrong, anyone can correct me if I'm wrong, I could be wrong about this. Has President Trump or Secretary Rubio actually said they're upset that USAID is interfering overseas or conducting regime change overseas? Or are they complaining about DEI and gay rights and all these other wedge issues that they use to pander to their support base? And they're just doing that so they can rebrand USAID, just like they're rebranding American imperialism with MAGA and America First. Now, what amazes me is that they're complaining about China going into Africa, building all this infrastructure. They talk about debt trap diplomacy. They talk about, well, China's going in there, they're going to build all this infrastructure, and then they're going to use it to control these countries indefinitely. Again, out of one side of their mouth. Out of the other side of their mouth, they're like, we built the Panama Canal 111 years ago. It's 1,000 miles away from our border. We should be going through it for free, and we should be administering it still. It was a bad deal. We shouldn't have made it, and now we're going to reverse it. Did they not hear themselves when they talk that they're doing in reality the very thing that they're always accusing China of in absolute fiction? And they just hope no one catches on. They just hope the Americans listening to them are so biased, so already poisoned against China that they just don't see through the hypocrisy. And you know what? It works, because I know so many Americans who are cheering on Trump, saying, "Yeah, this is America first. We're gonna make America bigger. We're not just gonna make it great. We're gonna make it bigger by taking over all of these territories and this infrastructure in this hemisphere." But then they're going to sit there and say, oh, maybe China is a threat to us. I mean, they're going into all these countries and building hospitals and power plants and railroads and schools. And, somehow that's bad. I mean, like, it doesn't add up. But again, if you go back to the very core of it, it really is just Americans being insecure that they've been told their whole life for generations they're number one, and they can see that they aren't, and they're having a meltdown. And there's no one coming in to help them and point them in a better direction. They're exploiting it to supercharge American imperialism, to try to reassert it.
Do you think that war is inevitable between China and the United States? Because the United States is not going to stop. I tell everybody, she is not going to stop. She may rebrand it, but she's not going to stop. And how long does America think that she will be able to supply the Chinese province of Chinese Taipei, or for those who don't know, Taiwan, with weapons and antagonize mainland China before they provoke a military and economic response?
Very good question. And I mean, of course, I bet everything. And I hope I'm wrong and I can shut down my channel. But if I'm wrong, I will shut down my channel and I'll never do another video. If I guarantee you that under the Trump administration, this drive to continue promoting separatism on Taiwan against America's own agreements with Beijing and in contravention of international law, they will continue this. But I want people to realize that their goal is not to protect Taiwan. They couldn't care less about Taiwan, the people who live there, infrastructure, the economy. They don't care about that. They're going to do to Taiwan what they've done to Ukraine. The goal was never for Ukraine to ever beat Russia. It was to raise the cost as high as possible to help overextend Russia as much as possible, fighting them to the last Ukrainian. And we can see that that is exactly what has happened in Ukraine. They never had a chance. They were never going to win. It was all about overextending Russia. And to a certain extent, it did extend Russia, which is all the more reason they're going to try to do this vis-a-vis China through Taiwan. They admit in their policy papers that Taiwan will be a pile of cinders when this is all done. There will be no economy. There will be no infrastructure. The population there will be devastated. They know this is going to happen. They're even more determined to do it because they know otherwise, inevitably, Taiwan will fully reunify with the rest of China. It's inevitable because it only makes sense. They are Chinese people. They speak Chinese. They're from mainland China. It is internationally recognized as part of China. I don't know if people realize that, but it is. It's even recognized as part of China by the U.S., even though they completely betray that agreement and that recognition. Their economy is already integrated with the rest of China. If they were to become independent from China, their economy would disappear almost overnight. There's no way for the U.S. and all of its proxies in the region or around the world to substitute the type of economic opportunities the rest of China offers Taiwan. And that only increases year to year. And people living in Taiwan, I think they know this. I think they understand this. So yes, there will be war. And again, it all comes down to people like Secretary Rubio saying, we don't want war with China. All they have to do is accept that we're going to carve Taiwan off out from their borders. All they have to do is accept we're going to put more and more. I don't know if people know this, there are U.S. troops on Taiwan right now. U.S. recognizes it as Chinese territory. They have U.S. troops occupying it. They will put more troops there. They will turn it into a forward operating base right off the coast of the rest of China. So that is what they're going to do unless China stops them. China is patient. They're not concerned with being humiliated by the U.S. U.S. humiliates China every opportunity it gets to try to provoke some sort of conflict. China is patient, and unless something drastic happens, they will try to avoid war. But they are prepared to go to war if the U.S. leaves them no option. So that is what we will watch the U.S. do. It was done all during the first Trump administration, all throughout the Biden administration, and it will continue under this current administration. Everything will be done possible to try to provoke a war with China sooner rather than later, because later, China will only be that much stronger and better able to overpower the U.S. in any sort of conflict. The other thing I want to warn people about is that the U.S. isn't really preparing to fight China head on over Taiwan. Taiwan is just a pretext to start a conflict. Their real plan is to implement a global maritime blockade on all Chinese shipping. China has a powerful military, but it is confined to China and its surrounding area. If the U.S. begins, say, I don't know, seizing the Panama Canal, just for example, someone might have been talking about that recently, or the Suez Canal, or the South China Sea even, or the Arctic, off the coast of Greenland, maybe. China does not have the ability to project military power to break these blockades. And I want to point out that even though this is something that President Trump has talked about all along, he's extremely anti-China. And even though he and his supporters called President Biden Beijing Biden, it was during the Biden administration that the U.S. Marine Corps was completely reorganized into an anti-shipping force. In other words, they were an expeditionary force that had air power, land power, sea power. They were basically a Swiss Army knife force. They could do anything, anywhere. They completely stripped those capabilities away, and they created a force that solely exists to interdict shipping. So they're again, step by step, administration to administration, they're putting all the pieces together on the board to prepare for this conflict with China, which will be provoked either between the Philippines and China or Taiwan and the rest of China. And that will be the pretext the U.S. uses to implement a maritime blockade worldwide. And so that's what China knows is going to happen. This is why they've invested so much in the Belt and Road Initiative. But in reaction to that, the U.S. has invested millions of dollars over many years to attack and undermine the Belt and Road Initiative. So it is a war that is already taking place. It's just happening through hybrid methods, and it's just a matter of time before it becomes more direct. As the U.S. becomes more desperate, the chances of it becoming more direct increase. Just like this conflict in Ukraine, we saw the U.S. and Europe get more and more involved as Ukrainian forces got weaker and weaker. And so this is and again, we have to remember that they're going after Russia specifically to isolate China. A maritime blockade trying to cut off resources to China doesn't work if Russia is right on their border and able to supply hydrocarbons and other raw materials to China's wartime economy. So they have to strip Russia away, isolate China for this to work. This is why they're doing it. This is the big picture. And when you understand this big picture and all the pieces that have to work together in combination, and you see how each administration has worked seamlessly to advance this big picture, then you can see through the partisan rhetoric, the left-right nonsense that is used to divide and distract people from the truth, that at election time they have no choice. This is an agenda that's going to continue, and it's going to come at the expense of the American people. You began by talking about tariffs. Who's going to pay the price for these tariffs? It's going to be the American people through cost of living.
Yeah, and Brian, like with the war, when it breaks out, have those leaders in Washington, D.C., and London, Brussels, thought about if China just embargoes them? Because 95% of all goods in the United States come from China. A huge portion in Europe comes from China. In the event of the war and China calls the dead end, and then China embargoes the United States within a week, all of the shelves are empty, and then you have to deal with massive unemployment because the businesses are shuttering, no transiting of goods. So now you have trucking, train, and cargo shutting down, more debt, and then you have defaults on bank loans, which means the banks then eventually go belly up. So now we're talking about a domino effect that will almost certainly kill the U.S. economy because it's already spiraling out of control. Have they taken that into consideration when they're thinking about antagonizing Russia and China, and specifically and especially the Chinese, because of the economic and political leverage that they truly hold over the United States? I don't think that they realize that America is not the America of 40 years ago, and China is not the China of 40 years ago. What do you say about that?
Oh, these are all really good points. Again, with the tariffs, the whole point of the tariffs is not to rebalance trade. I think Carl Zai, I don't know if it was on your show or somewhere else, he says a lot of really smart things. And one thing he said was that if the U.S. really wanted to rebalance trade and make it fair or make it more even, they wouldn't be banning China from buying in entire categories of goods and products. China cannot buy enough American microchips, for example, or graphic processor units. They can't get enough of these. They would buy as many as they could from the United States, and they would pay a premium price for it. They're happy to give their money to the U.S., and they're happy that the U.S. can supply this to them. They're not looking to undermine the U.S. position in this regard. But because the U.S. is not trying to balance trade, they're trying to contain and handicap China, stop its growth, stunt it, and contain it. That is why they're going to ban them from buying these products. That's what this is really about. And so the tariffs are not to rebalance trade. The tariffs are to decouple from China, because just as you said, if there was a war right now, it would be devastating for the U.S. and Europe, although the U.S. really doesn't care about Europe. They're proxies and they're expendable. But it would devastate the U.S., and the U.S. isn't really sure that they would come out on top at this point. So the point of the tariffs is to begin a permanent decoupling. They're not looking to negotiate anything with China. In the long term, they're looking to permanently decouple from China, and that is to prepare for war with China. So that is the whole point of it. And it's very convenient for the U.S. and the corporations that drive foreign policy. That's going to be the American people that pay the price for this. Now, just think about it. Think about what Trump and Biden have done with these tariffs and the cost of living crisis that continues to expand. And look at how Americans are viewing it and reacting to it. They're blaming each other and they're blaming China. The one thing they're not blaming are the people in Washington as a whole, as a group, and the interests behind them. That's the one thing they're not blaming, and they never will see through it because, again, it was a strategy of tension to divide and distract them from the truth and from getting together on common ground. They're too busy talking about men using women's bathrooms. They're too busy arguing over these things, and they don't see the real issue that is going to shred their country and destroy their livelihood. I mean, the livelihood of Americans is under threat first and foremost by Washington and Wall Street, not China, not by a long shot, not by a million years.
And I won't keep you much longer, Brian, but I have to. I've been waiting so long to talk to you, man, and I just want to pick your brain just a little bit. What about what's going on in Ukraine and it's vis-a-vis the United States and NATO concerning Russia?
Well, no worries. I still have time, so you ask as many questions as you'd like. With Ukraine, what was predictable, and many people have been saying this the entirety of this conflict, that it is a proxy war. Russia has approached it in a patient strategy of attrition manner, and we're starting to see the results of that manifesting themselves on the battlefield. The Ukrainian military is on the verge of collapse. I can't tell you how long until it collapses. There are stories that even Ukraine has acknowledged that it could be just 6 months. There are claims that there are officials in Russia saying something very similar. I couldn't tell you for sure, but what is for certain is that there has been an ammunition and weapon crisis all along. The West simply cannot make enough for Ukraine, and Ukraine couldn't absorb it anyway. But there's a huge manpower crisis, and they're talking about recruiting 18-year-olds and up to fill these gaps in the manpower. But the problem is, it's not just physical bodies to throw at the front. There's also a crisis in terms of properly training them and building up trained units. A trained unit isn't just a bunch of guys with basic training and guns. You also need to have officers and NCOs with years of experience, years of training and experience, and they're all dead, and you don't have time to reconstitute that leadership. So you have ineffective units. Doesn't matter how many people you can get, you can't properly train them, organize them, or lead them. So what you have is a disaster that will inevitably lead to collapse. It's just a matter of time. Now, the question is, what will happen when that begins? And there's a lot of hints that the U.S., possibly through Europe or a coalition of the willing, they will try to go into Ukraine and create some sort of buffer zone. The other possibility is that nations neighboring Ukraine, ironically, are going to absorb whatever is left of Ukraine, Western Ukraine, and that's how this would end. What I don't think they will allow is for Russia to just take all of Ukraine all the way up to its westernmost border. I don't think they're going to allow that to happen, and they will risk war. They're hoping that Russia wouldn't want to risk direct conflict with NATO, but at this point, I don't know, because from Russia's point of view, this has always been existential, and objectively, it is existential for Russia. This was always about, and here's the other thing about Trump that people are, I think, they want to ignore this. The whole conflict in Ukraine is over NATO and its expansion all along Russia's borders. There's only one reason for NATO to exist. It was to expand up to Russia's borders, encircle Russia, contain Russia, and eventually absorb Russia. It is an existential threat to the nation state of Russia, and that is what they're reacting to. So what has Trump said about NATO? Did he say, well, this is at the root of the problem, so maybe we should uproot NATO? Why do we even have NATO? Why can't we live in peace with Russia? The Europeans, before this conflict began, And before we forced them to, they were doing business with Russia. The economy of Europe depended on cheap Russian hydrocarbons. So what are we doing? This is insane. Just leave them alone and dismantle NATO. There's no point for it to even exist. But what has he actually said? Europe needs to spend more money on NATO. We're tired of putting X amount in. Europe has to match it. And if Europe were to match it, that would only expand NATO and make the crisis even more acute vis-a-vis Russia. So in reality, he's paying lip service to solving the conflict, while in reality, exasperating the root cause. So again, people need to listen to what he's actually saying, look at what he's actually doing, and not project what they wish was happening onto his administration. Because if you do that, you'll see straight through it, and you will see straight through all presidential administrations, regardless of party.
I remember, as you were talking, I remember reading something about Dmitry Medvedev, and he was saying that Russia could stop up past the Dnieper, or it could go past Kiev, or if the belligerents continue, Russia may take all of Ukraine, and if NATO intervenes, then Russia will start firing on NATO. Do you think that this is a high probability if NATO intervenes? Because the whole I would say the whole thing about NATO relies on them beating Russia in Ukraine, the funding, everything, because they need something to justify. Because remember, they always talk about NATO is the most powerful fighting force ever put together, and now we're looking at them being outgunned, outmatched, and defeated by what they deemed as a has-been ragtag Russian armed forces. And we're seeing that the roles have reversed, and Russia is the mighty power and not NATO. So do you think that, being desperate, they would intervene at first at the borders just to see if Russia would hit them, and if Russia doesn't hit them, they'll go further and set up a buffer zone? Or do you think that they would just slip in there and say, we're putting a buffer zone and don't attack us, or you attack NATO?
Yeah, no, I think that is what they're considering, and they've been putting the pieces in place. As a matter of fact, we remember all of this talk about creating all of these logistic corridors across Europe to the theater of conflict in Ukraine, in case Russia invades Poland or something like that. But actually, all they were doing is preparing for direct intervention in Ukraine itself. So they are definitely preparing for this. They're definitely preparing to either create a buffer zone or to absorb and annex what is left of Western Ukraine. That is what they're preparing to do. Whether they do it or not, or what Russia does, I have no idea. I cannot predict the future. One thing I will say, though, is not necessarily designed to defeat Russia in Ukraine, although failure to defeat Russia in Ukraine is going to create this conflict of credibility. It's going to make people, say, in the Philippines or on the island province of Taiwan, think twice before making themselves into proxies. Although maybe not, because I mean, there were plenty of examples preceding Ukraine that the Ukrainians should have learned from, and they obviously didn't. So that's another matter. But the main point was to extend Russia as much as possible. And I said, to a certain extent, that did work. For years, Russia protected Syria from US-sponsored regime change. Because of the conflict in Ukraine and Russia's focus and investment in Ukraine, they were unable to continue protecting Syria. Syria collapsed. The US overran Syria. That people can try to spin it any way they want, but we have to face reality, whether it's comfortable for us to or not. That was a loss for Russia. That was a loss for Syria. That was a loss for Iran, absolutely. And there's no way around it. And what it signifies is that there are limits to Russian and Iranian power. That was an indicator of it. How much further does that weakness go? Where else could cracks develop? Russia has invested heavily in Ukraine. Are there other areas that could crack? I don't know. But that was the whole point of this in the first place. There's a whole 2019 RAND Corporation document titled Extending Russia, and these were all literally on a list. Things to do to extend Russia. conflict in Ukraine, conflict in Syria, regime change in Georgia, destabilizing Central Asia. All of these were on the list. Sanctions against Russia, dumping hydrocarbons onto the market to lower prices and undermine Russian hydrocarbon exports. All of this was on the list. So they're doing all of this, and they're hoping somewhere enough cracks form and everything collapses. That's what they're hoping. So it's not necessarily a win in Ukraine that they're looking for. People need to keep that in mind. And they have a very similar strategy aimed directly at China. So again, it's not them trying to honestly protect their separatist client regime in Taiwan. It really is trying to bait them into a conflict to overextend them as they put pressure on Russia and China absolutely everywhere. So we have to keep that in mind and look at the big picture. It's not just this conflict happening in Ukraine. There's so much more beyond it that plays into it.
Yeah, and that's what I was telling my audience often, that it's not just in Ukraine. You see it in Syria. You see it in the Middle East. You see it in Armenia. You see it in Azerbaijan. You see it in Georgia and all across the former Soviet territories. And then when you go back around, a lot of people don't realize that the pressure that the United States continues to put on North Korea is not just against China, but is also against Russia, because North Korea borders both nations. And they don't realize that America is doing a full court press, because she knows that the time as the global hegemon is coming to an end. So she's putting it all out there to try to preserve her rule at all costs. Why do you think that so many people miss those points when we look at the big picture of what's going on geopolitically?
People more often than not, they want to see and hear what they want to see and hear. It's not that they're genuinely not interested in the truth, but like I said, the truth is extremely uncomfortable. And to face it, you have to make concessions that the world really is not the way you want it to be. It is an extremely ugly, unpleasant place. And it requires huge amounts of work and sacrifice to fix. It's so much easier to just believe everything is working the way you want it, to try to rationalize everything you see in a way that fits into this upward process towards hope, peace, and success. And so they miss out a lot of these things. I mean, people who look at Syria and they're making all of these excuses other than Russia and Iran just were incapable. They were overstretched, and that was a weak point, and it was a collapse. And you just have to accept that and move on. It's like people supporting the regime in Ukraine and NATO not wanting to accept the reality of what is happening in Ukraine. We've seen people like this. They're in a different plane of existence. They're in another universe. They're talking about, Kursk was a trap. We weren't really trying to take Kursk. We're just trying to do this or that. They're trying to rationalize what is happening in a way other than just facing reality. And it's not just them prone to do it. Everyone is prone to do it. I'm prone to do it. I have to every single day ask myself, am I being objective? Am I looking at the facts? Am I looking at the bigger picture? Or am I seeing what I want to see? Because what I want to see is a multipolar world emerge, a better balance of power between nations instead of one nation squatting upon all other nations. That's what I would love to see. Is that going to happen? I don't know. Can the U.S. destroy and unhinge everything before that happens? Yes, absolutely. Don't underestimate America, especially in its capacity to divide and destroy everything. That is their specialty. So we have to constantly check where we actually are, because if there is a solution, we have to see the problem clearly in order to arrive at a clear solution. If we're lying to ourselves, if we're not going to acknowledge what is really wrong, how could we possibly arrive at a solution to all of these problems? So we have to keep that in mind. At the end of the day, if we really want the world to be a better place, we have to face what is really wrong with it and what is really happening to it. So this is why I'm warning people who are invested in the Trump hope and change. I mean, is it because there's evidence that he's actually doing this, or is it because you just wish this was happening? And I don't blame people for wishing that it was happening. I mean, how can you? I mean, they understand something is chronically wrong with the U.S. and they want it fixed. So that is a good thing. The problem is they're placing hope into people instead of principles, and they're willing to defend those people no matter how egregiously they've departed from those principles.
So in closing, Brian, if you had a crystal ball, what would your crystal ball say when it concerns Trump and his promises and what's going to come domestically in the U.S.? And also, what would that crystal ball have to say about the economic situation of the West and its position vis-a-vis the BRICS?
Well, I mean, these tariffs are only going to make the cost of living crisis worse. Now, I have not been in the U.S. for many years. I mean, I've lived almost my entire adult life in Asia, but I have family in the United States, and they are constantly telling me about the cost of living crisis that they face day to day. And it is bad, and it is getting worse. And I don't know how bad it actually is. I don't know how widespread it is, but it seems very bad. And these tariffs on China are only going to make it worse. And again, the goal is to it's like they can't. People are saying, well, it's going to be, a difficult process to reindustrialize. They're not reindustrializing. If you want to reindustrialize, you need to reform your education. You need to rebuild your infrastructure. They're not even talking about doing that. So this is only about decoupling and transferring the cost of decoupling to the American people. And the brilliance behind this, especially with Trump, is that he is so able to blame China and have people honestly believe inside their brains that this is all somehow China's fault. China, as Carl Zahl always says, is taking and eating our lunch. This is the same thing with COVID. Do you remember people were saying, COVID is all China's fault? They weren't able to detect and warn the world and contain it and stop it in China, and then it spread over to us. Why weren't you able to detect it inside the United States, contain it, and stop it from spreading? People even stop and think about this. It's the same logic with blaming Canada and Mexico for fentanyl and immigration. If you can't secure your own borders and police your own communities, how is Canada and Mexico supposed to do this for you? And then the fentanyl is another perfect example of a crisis the U.S. deliberately made itself and is blaming successfully, I might add, on China. There's people who will tell you, especially when Vice President Vance repeats this lie, that China is making fentanyl and smuggling it into the United States. That is not what's happening. That's not even what the U.S. government is officially accusing China of. They're complaining because China makes the precursor ingredients for fentanyl. Gangs through shell companies are buying these ingredients. They're making fentanyl in labs both in the U.S. and over the U.S. border, and that is how it's getting into the U.S. And by the way, these cartels that the U.S. is talking about going into Mexico and fighting, almost all of them are connected to the CIA. Do people not remember CIA planes crashing because they were so packed with cocaine coming over the border into the U.S. to pump it into American communities and get everyone hooked on drugs and destroy the fabric of American communities? That was the CIA. That wasn't China. That was the CIA doing it. They're still doing it. So, if I'm looking into my crystal ball, it looks very hopeless because these are things that are not new. These are old things. I'm in my 40s. I'm not that old, but I'm not that young. I remember all of this. There's people who are much older than me that's like a goldfish. They forgot all of this. They forgot all about these things, and they're falling for all of these lies because one, they want to place their hope in Trump. They want to ignore the reality that what he's saying and doing simply does not add up. And so they're willing to ignore all of these warning signs that he's just lying to them, just like every other politician. I mean, like what is more likely, that he really wants to change all these things and he's just goofing it up again in his second administration, or he's just another politician lying to you, telling you what you want to hear to get your support, and then doing the exact opposite once he's in office and there's nothing you could do to hold him accountable? I mean, which one is more likely? It just is so frustrating watching people selectively hear and see what Trump is doing when they were so clear-eyed about the Biden administration and vice versa. People doing it the other way around, only seeing things that Trump is doing wrong, and they were completely blind and asleep during the Biden administration. It's very frustrating to see this. What people need to do is think about what they really want to see America do, come together on common ground there, and then see through the lies no matter who is telling them. This crystal ball, like I'm trying to think, crystal ball in the future, the cost of living is going to get worse, and this is going to create desperation that will make war with China a better sell for the American people, and war in general easier to sell to the American people. So we're in for a rough ride. The empire is desperate, and I think, as we talked about earlier, there's this deeply seated sense of superiority that prevents them from backing down. They will not back down, and they are not paying a personal cost. Right now, their proxies are paying the cost. Europe, Ukraine, the people on Taiwan, Philippines, they're paying the cost. Next to pay the cost will be the American people. They will be the last ones to pay the cost. There's no consequences. There's no reason for them to stop. So they're not going to stop anytime soon, unfortunately.
And do you see a systemic collapse happening all at once? Or because people say, well, it'll happen in stages, but we're going through the stages now. So do you see that we're at the end of this kicking the can down the road economically and politically?
I don't think there's going to be a drastic all-at-once collapse. I mean, a lot of people have been predicting that for many, many years. I mean, people who maybe followed Alex Jones like 10, 20 years ago, I mean, that's all he talked about is like, it's going to cost. And I understand why people think that, because it's constantly getting worse and worse every single year. And you're thinking, how much worse can it get? You have to understand that literally every person on planet Earth has a certain sense of self-preservation. And so when nations, communities, and individuals are all fighting for self-preservation, it creates a certain sense of resilience. And no matter how bad things get, people can always find a way to kind of kick the can down the road. And you have to remember that everything the U.S. does to say Russia and China are going to do something in response. They have a sense of self-preservation. They have long-term plans. They are trying to build resiliency. And they're also, if people are paying attention, as much as they want to convince you that Russia and China are the enemies of America, they're bending over backwards to try to manage America's decline so that there is no war and so that no one has to pay a steep price for the collapse of the American empire. They are giving America exits, graceful, dignified exits from empire. It's just the people driving the empire and benefiting from it, refusing to walk through them. So we have to keep all of this in mind. I think it will be very hard for a sudden and absolute collapse. I hope that an all-out war is something that could be avoided, but like we talked about, that, you know, from their point of view, they have nothing to lose. That's what makes them so dangerous. The more desperate they become, the more dangerous they become. I think that's self-evident at this point.
Brian, thank you once again, man. You hit it out the park again. This is why everybody loves your analysis on everything, man. And this is why I was dying to get you back on the program, man. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And you're doing excellent work. I love coming on. I love having these conversations. It's very rare to find people that can see through the partisan rhetoric, see through the left and right, and just try to look at the facts. So it's always a pleasure and an honor to come on. I'd be happy to come on again in the future.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you so much, man. Hey, be blessed. I'll contact you, and stay safe, Brian.
Thank you. You too. Bye.
Everybody, hit the like button. Please hit the like button. Subscribe and like, share. Feel free to share. Now, as I go out, I always tell you this. For those of you who are new to the show, let me share something with you. I always say, treat others as you would have them treat you. Do right by others, not because there's some material gain in it or because there's some praise that comes behind it. Do right because it's the right thing to do. And even when no one else is watching you, remember that God has his eyes stayed on you. Now, if you love truth, know that I love you, but know that the love that I have for you will always pale in comparison to the love that God has for you. Until we next speak again, stay strong, stay true. But above all things, remember to stay righteous. Hey, mama, your baby boy loves you more than life. Thank you, everybody. Deuces. We're out of here. Peace.
Told you to walk away. That was my first and last mistake. I'm blue without your face. But what can I do? 'Cause I'm just a sinking ship, and you're just a pair of lips that I've lost in the moment.